The story begins in the vast and shifting lands of Eastern Europe in the early 16th century, where kingdoms rose and fell, and where the borders of empires blurred beneath the march of armies and the shifting allegiances of nobles. In this landscape of uncertainty was born a girl who would one day walk the polished marble floors of Topkapi Palace and hold in her hands the fate of the Ottoman throne. She was not born into nobility. She was not born into the promise of command. Instead, she began life in obscurity, in a small town believed to be in what is now Ukraine, a place of modest homes, of wooden churches, of farmers who bent their backs to the soil. Her birth name is uncertain, but she would come to be known to history as Roxolana, the red-haired concubine who became a sultana and the undisputed power beside the greatest ruler of her age. Her childhood was ordinary in its simplicity. She lived among fields and rivers, in a land where invasions and raids were frequent. The people of her region often suffered under the incursions of Tatar raiders, who scoured villages for captives to be sold in the slave markets of Crimea and beyond. For young girls, the threat was always present, lurking at the edge of daily life. Roxolana's fate arrived with such a raid when armed horsemen swept through her community, seizing men, women and children. She was torn from her family, marched away in chains, and carried across the Black Sea to a destiny neither she nor her captors could have imagined. The cruelty of that moment cannot be overstated, for a child wrenched from her home knew she would never see it again. Yet within that tragedy lay the seed of her astonishing rise. She was sold in the bustling slave markets, where merchants and buyers negotiated prices, as if human lives were nothing more than wares. From there she was transported into the orbit of the Ottoman Empire, the greatest power of its time. The empire stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of the Balkans, from the eastern plains of Anatolia to the gates of Vienna. At its heart stood Istanbul, once Constantinople, crowned with the domes and minarets of mosques, palaces and markets, humming with the movement of merchants, soldiers, clerics and scholars. Into this city, amid its grandeur and its cruelty, Roxolana arrived as a slave destined for the imperial harem. The harem of Topkapi Palace was no simple gathering of women. It was a world unto itself, a place of ritual, hierarchy and politics, hidden from the eyes of most men. To outsiders, it might have seemed a realm of pleasure and idleness, where women reclined on silken cushions and served the desires of the sultan. Yet in truth, the harem was a crucible of ambition, competition and maneuvering. Each woman who entered carried with her a dream of rising in favor, of bearing sons, of securing her place in the palace's delicate balance of power. It was a place where rivalries could be deadly, where whispers mattered as much as swords, and where the future of the empire itself could be shaped by the intrigues of women hidden behind gilded screens. When Roxolana entered this hidden world, she might have seemed an unlikely figure to rise above others. She was foreign, she was enslaved, and she had no powerful family to support her. But she carried with her an intelligence, a resilience, and a charm that would distinguish her from the many other women who filled the Sultan's chambers. Her hair, said to be a striking shade of red, and her bright spirit earned her the name by which she became known. Roxolana, meaning the woman from Ruthenia. In the Ottoman court, she was also given the name Harem, meaning the cheerful one. This name captured her nature, for she possessed a warmth and wit that could disarm suspicion and win affection. At this time, the ruler of the empire was Suleiman, who would later be called the Magnificent. Suleiman was a man of immense power, a warrior and lawgiver, a sultan who carried the weight of an empire that touched 3 continents. He had inherited the throne in 1520 and quickly distinguished himself not only as a military commander, but also as a patron of the arts, a poet, and a man who valued intelligence as much as beauty. In the tradition of his predecessors, he was surrounded by concubines in the harem, women who were meant to provide him with heirs and companionship. Yet in this vast collection of women, none had yet captured his heart so fully that she could stand above all others. It was Roxolana who achieved what none before her had done. When she came before Suleiman, something in her presence stirred his interest. Perhaps it was her quick wit, perhaps her laughter that echoed differently in the marble halls, perhaps the way she carried herself with both humility and quiet confidence. Whatever the spark, Suleiman found himself drawn to her. Their relationship began as the encounter of a sultan with a concubine, but it soon deepened into something far more enduring. Roxolana did not merely amuse him, she engaged him. She conversed with him as an equal, surprising him with her intelligence, her insight, and her understanding of the complexities of the world. Where others sought only to please, she sought to converse, to connect. It was this connection that transformed her from a mere concubine into his confidante. Her rise within the harem was swift and startling. Other concubines grew resentful as Suleiman's attention lingered increasingly on Roxolana. Rivalries sharpened, yet Roxolana proved adept at navigating these treacherous waters. She did not falter under the jealousy of others. Instead, she cultivated her bond with Suleiman, weaving herself not only into his private affections, but into his political life as well. She bore him children, solidifying her position in the palace, for in the Ottoman world, the mother of a prince wielded considerable influence. But Roxolana went further. She persuaded Suleiman to do what no sultan had done in centuries, to take a concubine as his lawful wife. In an empire where sultans traditionally avoided marriage to preserve political flexibility, this was a radical act. Yet Suleiman married Roxolana, and in doing so, elevated her from a slave to a sultana. This transformation was more than personal triumph. It shifted the very structure of the Ottoman court. Roxolana now stood as a legitimate queen, a partner to the sultan, and a figure whose influence reached into the affairs of state. She wrote letters to foreign rulers, she commissioned charitable works, and she became a patron of architecture and the arts. Mosques, schools, and hospitals rose at her command, bearing witness to her presence in the empire's public life. Yet her influence was not only in stone and parchment. It was also in the whispers of palace politics, in the choices Suleiman made under her counsel, and in the succession struggles that shaped the future of the dynasty. Roxolana's position brought her into conflict with powerful figures. The most notable of these was Ibrahim Pasha, Suleiman's Grand Vizier and closest friend since childhood. Ibrahim was a man of immense authority, entrusted with the Sultan's armies and with the governance of the empire. He had risen from slavery himself, yet his power rivaled that of princes. Roxolana, recognizing that Ibrahim's influence threatened her own, worked quietly to undermine him. Tensions grew between the vizier and the sultana, and in time, Suleiman turned against his old companion. Ibrahim was executed in 1536, his vast wealth confiscated, his memory erased from public monuments. Many believed Roxolana's hand had guided this downfall, her influence over Suleiman proving stronger than even the bonds of lifelong friendship. Her power did not end there. She became deeply involved in the succession of Suleiman's heirs. In the Ottoman system, the throne did not pass automatically to the eldest son. Instead, multiple sons might compete, leading often to fratricidal struggles. Roxolana, determined to secure the throne for her own children, maneuvered against the Sultan's firstborn Mustafa, who was the son of another concubine. Mustafa was popular with the army and regarded as a strong candidate for succession. To Roxolana, he was a threat to her son's future. In the web of intrigue that followed, Roxolana and her allies painted Mustafa as disloyal, accusing him of plotting against his father. Whether true or not, Suleiman believed the charges. In 1553, Mustafa was executed by his father's command, strangled by bowstring in his tent. This act shocked the empire, but it cleared the way for Roxolana's son Selim to ascend after Suleiman's death. Throughout these years, Roxolana continued to exert her influence not only in the palace, but in the empire's public life. She corresponded with rulers abroad, including the King of Poland and the Shah of Persia. She shaped diplomatic relations, acting as an intermediary in negotiation. She funded grand charitable complexes, including the Hayski Sultan Mosque in Istanbul, which remains to this day a testament to her legacy. She demonstrated that a woman who began as a captive could become not merely the consort of a sultan, but a shaper of imperial policy, a queen in all but name. Yet her story was not without shadows. The intrigues of the harem, the executions of rivals, the bloody struggles for succession, all bore the mark of her hand. To some, she was a schemer, a manipulator who corrupted Suleiman's judgment and led him to acts of cruelty. To others, she was a visionary, a woman who rose above her station to wield power with intelligence and purpose. Both views contain truths, for Roxolana was neither saint nor villain alone. She was, above all, a survivor who seized the circumstances of her captivity and transformed them into unprecedented power. Roxolana did not live to see Suleiman's final campaigns. She died in 1558, after nearly 4 decades in the palace, having secured the future of her sons and left an indelible mark on the empire. Suleiman, who had loved her deeply, mourned her passing. She was buried in a tomb near his own grand mausoleum in the Süleymaniye Mosque complex, their resting places forever bound in stone. In death, as in life, she remained close to the Sultan who had raised her from slavery to sovereignty. Her legacy endures as one of the most remarkable transformations in history. From a village girl captured in a raid to a concubine in the imperial harem, to the wife of the greatest Ottoman sultan, to the mother of a dynasty, her journey defies expectations. She altered the traditions of the Ottoman court, reshaped the succession of sultans, and expanded the influence of women within the empire. The story of Roxolana is not merely one of personal ascent, but of how individuals, even from the most unlikely beginnings, can shape the course of empires. As one reflects on her life, one cannot help but be struck by the currents of fate that carried her. A raid upon a village brought her into bondage. A slave market delivered her to Istanbul. A chance meeting with Suleiman altered the course of her destiny. And yet, within these circumstances, she carved her own path, using her intelligence, her charm, and her resilience to command power in a world where women were rarely seen, and even more rarely heard. Her life is a reminder that history is not only the tale of kings and generals, but also of those who, from the shadows of obscurity, rise to wield influence greater than armies. And so the tale of Roxolana endures, told in whispers and in chronicles, in marble mosques and in the lines of letters sent across continents. She remains a figure of fascination, a woman who began as a captive and ended as a queen, a pleasure slave who commanded a sultan, and a mother whose legacy continued through generations of Ottoman rulers. In the quiet halls of history, her laughter, the laughter that once charmed a sultan, still seems to echo. The years that followed Ibrahim Pasha's fall marked a turning point not only in the life of Roxolana, but in the entire empire itself. For Roxolana, the execution of the Grand Vizier had removed one of the greatest obstacles to her influence over Suleiman. Yet with Ibrahim's death, she also revealed to the world that her presence in the palace was no fleeting favor, no passing delight of a sultan's desire. She had become a force to be reckoned with, a woman whose laughter and intelligence had reshaped the course of the Ottoman dynasty. From that moment forward, Roxolana was no longer seen as simply the Sultan's consort. She was his partner in governance, his companion in statecraft, and his closest counselor in matters both intimate and imperial. Her new authority was not without risks. The harem remained a place of rivalries where jealousies burned as fiercely as the lamps in the palace corridors. Mehmed IV, the mother of Prince Mustafa, continued to simmer with resentment. She had once been Suleiman's favoured concubine, and her son Mustafa was beloved by the army and admired by many throughout the empire. Mustafa represented tradition, continuity and strength. Roxolana's children, though numerous, were younger and less established. The balance of succession remained perilously uncertain. It was here that Roxolana's sharp mind and unyielding ambition turned toward the future, for she understood better than most that her security and her legacy depended on ensuring that one of her own sons inherited the throne. While intrigue consumed the private quarters of the palace, the empire itself expanded in glory. Suleiman led campaigns across Europe, pressing into Hungary, menacing Vienna, and securing Ottoman control of the eastern Mediterranean. He became the figurehead of an empire at its zenith, hailed by his people as a Kanuni, the lawgiver, for his codification of Ottoman law. Yet even as he commanded armies, his heart and his ear remained attuned to Roxolana. From her chambers in Topkapi, she corresponded with him, offering counsel, encouragement, and at times subtle persuasion. Letters written in her delicate hand have survived, filled with warmth and intimacy, but also with reminders of loyalty and trust. They reveal a relationship that was not one of mere passion, but of enduring partnership. Roxolana had achieved what few women in history had accomplished. She had entwined her destiny so completely with that of a ruler that his decisions bore the imprint of her influence. Her ambitions reached beyond the palace walls. Roxolana took an active role in shaping the empire's image and welfare. She commissioned vast charitable projects, fulfilling the Islamic tradition of pious endowment or wasifa. In Istanbul, she ordered the construction of the Hayski Sultan Mosque complex, a grand ensemble of a mosque, a school, a hospital, and a soup kitchen. These works not only elevated her reputation as a benefactress of the people, but also carved her presence into the very fabric of the city. Travelers from far lands marveled at these monuments, noting that the Sultan's wife had inscribed her name in stone, an honor few women in Ottoman history had ever attained. Through these acts, Roxolana secured not only spiritual merit, but also political capital, for generosity to the poor bound her image to the welfare of the people and silenced many critics who might otherwise have dismissed her as a manipulative foreigner. But within the palace, shadows continued to lengthen. The question of succession loomed like a storm cloud over Suleiman's reign. Mustafa, the eldest prince, grew into a man admired for his leadership and courage. He commanded armies with skill and earned the loyalty of the Janissaries, the elite corps of the empire. Among the soldiers and many officials, Mustafa was regarded as the natural heir, destined to inherit the Sultan's mantle. Yet, to Roxolana, Mustafa was a mortal threat. She knew that should he ascend, her own sons would be pushed aside, or worse, eliminated, for Ottoman succession often demanded the blood of rival brothers. For Roxolana, protecting her children meant confronting Mustafa's future directly. Here began one of the darkest episodes of her story. Roxolana, with the aid of her ally Rustam Pasha, who had married her daughter Mihrimah and risen to the position of Grand Vizier, subtly poisoned Suleiman's mind against Mustafa. Whispers circulated that Mustafa harbored ambitions beyond his station, that he sought to usurp his father, that he conspired with the Persians against Ottoman unity. Whether these charges were truth or fabrication is debated even to this day, but the result was undeniable. Suleiman, convinced of Mustafa's disloyalty, ordered his execution during the campaign of 1553. In the quiet of his tent, Mustafa was strangled by the bowstring, his death sending shockwaves through the empire. Soldiers wept, people murmured in disbelief, and many blamed Roxolana for orchestrating the downfall of the prince who might have been their next sultan. This act secured the path for Roxolana's own children, but it also cemented her reputation as a woman of ruthless resolve. To her enemies, she became the embodiment of manipulation, a sorceress who had ensnared the Sultan and twisted him against his own blood. To her supporters, she was a mother who had done what was necessary to protect her sons in a brutal system where fratricide was the norm. In either case, she proved once again that she was not merely a figure of beauty or charm, but of unrelenting political will. Her power was not confined to domestic affairs. Roxolana extended her reach into the wider world through diplomacy. She corresponded with foreign rulers, including the Polish king and the Shah of Persia, using her pen as deftly as any statesman wielded words. Ambassadors in Istanbul spoke of her influence, noting how decisions seemed to flow not only from the divan of viziers, but from the private chambers of the sultana. In a world dominated by men, Roxolana carved a space for herself in the very center of imperial politics, her voice resonating in corridors of power far beyond the harem walls. Yet even as her influence peaked, the burdens of age and responsibility pressed upon her. The years of intrigue, of maneuvering, of balancing rivalries had taken their toll. She continued to build, to donate, to counsel, but her health began to falter. In 1558, after decades beside Suleiman, Roxolana passed away. The palace was shrouded in mourning, for though she had been feared and envied, she had also been loved. Suleiman himself, the conqueror of kings and the master of an empire, wept for her. He ordered her buried in a grand tomb within the Sodimaniye Mosque complex, near where his own body would one day rest. Their closeness in life was mirrored in death, their mausoleums standing side by side as eternal symbols of their union. Her passing did not erase her legacy. Through her son Selim, who would later become Sultan, she ensured the continuation of her line. Through her daughter Mihrimah, she extended her influence into generations of Ottoman politics. Through her buildings, her charities, her letters, she remained alive in the memory of the empire. And through the countless stories told of her rise, from slave to queen, from concubine to power behind the throne, she became a legend whose name outlived the centuries. Roxolana's life illustrates the paradox of power within the Ottoman world. She began as an outsider, as a captive torn from her homeland, as a woman without agency or freedom. Yet she transformed those very chains into instruments of command. She navigated a system designed to silence women, and instead found a voice that echoed across continents. Her story is not one of simple romance, nor of mere scheming. It is a story of resilience, of adaptability, of intelligence sharpened by necessity, and of ambition pursued with unyielding determination. It is the story of how one woman, through charm and cunning, reshaped the fate of an empire. When travelers walked through Istanbul in the years after her death, they passed her mosque, her charitable kitchens feeding the hungry, her schools educating children. They passed the tomb where she lay, surrounded by intricate tiles and inscriptions of mercy. And whether they cursed her name as a temptress or praised her as a queen, they could not deny that she had left her mark. Her laughter, once ringing in the palace halls, had become a whisper carried through history, reminding all who heard it that even in the darkest of circumstances, one could rise to command the course of nations. The story of Roxolana does not end with her burial. It continues in the memory of every historian who has studied her, in the legends woven around her image, in the debates that still rage over her true character. Was she a manipulator who destroyed rivals to satisfy her ambition? Was she a visionary who expanded the possibilities for women in the empire? Was she simply a survivor who did what she must in a brutal world? Perhaps she was all of these, for human lives cannot be reduced to simple portraits. Roxolana remains, above all, a reminder of the complexity of power, of the interplay of love and ambition, of the ways in which individuals can shape the destinies of empires. And so her story flows into the larger story of the Ottoman world, a world of sultans and viziers, of soldiers and poets, of mosques and markets, of glories and tragedies. Within that world, a girl once stolen from her village rose to command not only the heart of a sultan, but the direction of an empire. Hers was a journey from obscurity to prominence, from chains to sovereignty, from silence to a voice that has never been forgotten. Even now, centuries later, her life continues to fascinate, to provoke, to inspire. Roxolana, the pleasure slave who commanded a sultan, remains an indelible figure in the great tapestry of history, her story one of the most extraordinary ever told. After the death of Roxolana in 1558, the palace of Topkapi felt strangely hollow. For nearly 4 decades, her presence had shaped its rhythms, her laughter and her counsel weaving themselves into the very texture of Suleiman's reign. Without her, the Sultan stood as a man burdened by age, by grief, and by the heavy mantle of empire. He had conquered lands, issued laws, built monuments, and struck fear into kings, but the loss of Roxolana left him diminished in spirit. Her tomb stood not far from his own great mosque, and often the Sultan visited it, sitting in silence, a figure of immense authority bowed by private sorrow. To the empire he remained a Kanuni, the lawgiver, and a magnificent to the astonished West. But within his chambers he was a widower, bereft of the woman who had shared his burdens and guided his hand. The empire, however, could not pause for grief. Its frontiers stretched wide and demanded vigilance. The Mediterranean simmered with conflict as the Ottoman navy clashed with European powers. In the east, the Persians remained both rivals and adversaries. And in Europe, the memory of Ottoman armies at Vienna lingered like a shadow, compelling Christian monarchs to guard their borders and plot their defences. Suleiman, though aged, continued to campaign. His body grew weary, but his will remained iron. For the Sultan understood that his authority rested not only in palaces and laws, but on the field of battle, where the loyalty of soldiers was forged. Yet, even as he rode to war, the palace behind him remained a crucible of intrigue. Roxolana's absence left a vacuum that others sought to fill. Her daughter Mirima, intelligent and ambitious, continued her mother's legacy by supporting her brother Selim and guiding court politics. Rustam Pasha, her son-in-law, wielded the office of Grand Vizier with calculation, his alliance with Roxolana's children ensuring their survival. Mehmed IV, long eclipsed by Roxolana, lived in bitter obscurity, mourning the execution of her son Mustafa, whose death had cleared the path for Roxolana's line. The rivalry of mothers had ended in blood, but its consequences stretched far beyond the harem walls, for it determined the future shape of the dynasty itself. Selim, Roxolana's favoured son stood now as the heir apparent. His nature was markedly different from his father's. Where Suleiman embodied the warrior king, stern and disciplined, Selim leaned toward indulgence and ease. He was known for his fondness for wine, for music, for the comforts of the harem rather than the hardships of campaign. The Janissaries and many statesmen looked upon him with skepticism, doubting whether such a prince could uphold the grandeur of the empire. Yet Roxolana's maneuvers, her unrelenting determination, had cleared the way for him. Her absence did not erase her work. Instead, it revealed itself fully as Selim prepared to inherit the throne. The decline of Suleiman's vigour became evident in the late 1560s. Age pressed heavily upon him, yet he resolved to lead one last great campaign against Hungary. In 1566, at the age of 72, he mounted his horse and departed for the front, refusing to yield command to younger men. His body was failing, but his will sought one final victory to crown his reign. As the armies marched, whispers spread that the Sultan was ill. In his tent outside Shaididvar, Suleiman the Magnificent breathed his last. His death was concealed for weeks, so that the army might not falter, his body preserved while the viziers managed the transition of power. The conqueror who had ruled for nearly half a century, whose reign had marked the zenith of Ottoman glory, was gone. He left behind a vast empire and a legacy unmatched by any of his predecessors. With his passing, Selim ascended the throne, remembered in history as Selim II. He was the first Ottoman sultan born of a legal marriage, the son of Roxolana, whose boldness had broken tradition by binding Suleiman in wedlock. His reign was therefore an extension of her legacy, though his character bore little resemblance to hers. Selim, known to later generations as a Selim the Sot, preferred the pleasures of the palace to the perils of campaign. Where his father had led armies in person, Selim delegated command to his admirals and viziers. Under his rule, the Ottoman Empire reached the height of its naval power, not through his own hand, but through the genius of commanders like Lala Mustafa and Payal Pasha, and most famously, the corsair turned Admiral Ulus Ali. Selim's greatest triumph came at sea in 1571, when the Ottoman navy clashed with the combined forces of Europe at the Battle of Lepanto. Though the Ottomans suffered a crushing defeat in that battle, losing hundreds of ships, Selim's commanders rebuilt the fleet with astonishing speed, and within a year, the empire's naval dominance was restored. This resilience testified not to Selim's leadership, but to the institutional strength that Roxolana and Suleiman had helped to shape. The empire was vast enough, wealthy enough, and organized enough to withstand even the greatest setbacks. Within the palace, Selim's indulgence deepened. He surrounded himself with musicians, poets, and concubines, preferring the sweetness of wine to the rigors of governance. His reliance on viziers grew, marking the beginning of a shift in Ottoman politics where grand viziers, rather than sultans, increasingly steered the affairs of state. Yet in all his pleasures, Selim remained indebted to his mother. Roxolana's determination had cleared away rivals, secured alliances, and built the foundation of his succession. Without her, he might have been but one prince among many, lost to the bloody contests that so often consumed Ottoman dynasties. Through him, her bloodline continued to rule, ensuring her influence extended beyond her lifetime. Mehmed Sultan, Roxolana's daughter, also carried forward her mother's legacy. She continued to commission architectural works, including mosques, designed by the famed architect Sinan. Her correspondence with European rulers reflected the same diplomatic engagement that Roxolana had pioneered. In her, the tradition of female influence within the Ottoman court endured, a legacy of power that would reach its height in the later period known as the Sultanate of Women, when consorts and mothers of sultans would guide the empire from behind the veil. The story of Roxolana thus did not end with her death. It echoed through her children, through the policies they pursued, through the monuments that bore her name, through the shifts in court culture that she had initiated. She had redefined the role of women in the Ottoman world, not by overturning the system but by mastering it. The harem, once seen merely as a private space for the sultan's pleasure, became a political arena where women could shape the future of the empire. Later sultanas, such as Kösem and Turhan, would follow the path Roxolana had blazed, ruling as regents, commanding viziers, and directing policy. But it was Roxolana who had shown that such a role was possible. Selim's reign ended in 1574. His years as sultan marked less by conquest than by consolidation. He died, as rumour claimed, after slipping in his bath while drunk, an inglorious end compared to the magnificence of his father. Yet the empire he left behind remained vast and formidable, and his descendants continued to rule for centuries. His reign demonstrated the endurance of the structures Roxolana and Suleiman had built. Even a sultan more devoted to pleasure than to politics could sit on the throne without bringing collapse. That strength, however, carried within it the seeds of future decline, for the absence of direct, disciplined leadership slowly eroded the empire's vitality in the centuries to come. Through all these shifts, Roxolana's memory lingered. Chroniclers debated her character, some condemning her as a manipulator whose intrigues had stained the empire with blood, others praising her as a wise counselor who brought stability and charity. Travelers from Europe wrote of her with fascination, weaving tales of her rise from slavery to sovereignty. In art and literature, she became a symbol of both desire and danger, the woman who had captured the heart of the greatest sultan of his age. Her mosque still stood in Istanbul, its minarets piercing the sky, its courtyard echoing with the footsteps of worshippers. Her tomb remained beside Suleiman's, a testament to the enduring bond that had defied tradition and reshaped history. The generations that followed could not escape her shadow. Every prince who ascended owed his throne to the bloodline she had secured. Every sultana who wielded power followed the precedent she had established. Every vizier who feared the whispers of the harem remembered the fate of Ibrahim Pasha and the execution of Mustafa. Roxolana had altered the rules of empire, ensuring that no one could again dismiss the harem as a place without consequence. And so her story, though bound by the limits of time, stretched far beyond her own years. It was a story of resilience born of captivity, of ambition sharpened by necessity, of love entwined with politics, of triumph shadowed by tragedy. From the village of her birth to the palace of Istanbul, from the chains of slavery to the throne of empire, she traversed a journey that few could have imagined. In the great sweep of Ottoman history, filled with sultans, viziers, soldiers and scholars, her name endures as one of the most remarkable of all. She was not merely a concubine, nor merely a queen. She was a force that shaped the destiny of an empire, a woman whose laughter, intelligence and willpower commanded a sultan and through him commanded history itself. When Selim II passed from the world in 1574, the empire entered a new phase, one shaped not by the towering shadow of Suleiman the Magnificent, nor by the guiding hand of Roxolana, but by their descendants who struggled to carry the immense weight of the Ottoman inheritance. Selim's reign had been marked by indulgence and delegation. Though he preferred the pleasures of the harem to the rigours of war, his empire remained vast, its armies disciplined, its institutions firm. The true measure of Selim's rule was not in his own deeds, but in the strength of the structures that Suleiman and Roxolana had built. Yet with his death, the delicate balance of power shifted once more, and the palace of Topkapi became a crucible of intrigue that echoed with the whispers of women, viziers and soldiers alike. His son Murad IV ascended to the throne. Murad was young, energetic and filled with promise, but he too bore the habits of indulgence. He fathered a vast number of children. Some chroniclers claimed more than 100, many born to concubines within the harem. His reign revealed most clearly how the harem had become the true engine of dynastic politics. The mothers of princes maneuvered constantly for the survival of their sons, knowing that succession was not guaranteed, that the palace was as dangerous as any battlefield. The execution of brothers remained a grim tradition of Ottoman inheritance, a practice designed to prevent civil war but carried out with merciless efficiency. Each new sultan began his reign by ordering the deaths of his siblings, an act both horrifying and necessary in the logic of empire. For the mothers of princes, every day was a contest for survival. Murad's mother, Mehmed Sultan, now emerged as the most powerful woman in the empire. She had been a Venetian-born concubine, captured and brought into the harem much like Roxolana before her. Mehmed continued Roxolana's legacy of female influence, shaping policy, advising her son, and corresponding with foreign rulers. She cultivated ties with Venice, her homeland, ensuring that the empire maintained a favourable balance in Mediterranean politics. Ambassadors wrote of her wisdom and her ability to sway the court. In her, The Sultanate of Women took on new life, demonstrating that Roxolana had not been an anomaly, but the beginning of a new order. The harem was no longer merely a private space. It was a political institution whose decisions shaped the fate of millions. Murad's reign, however, was troubled. The empire remained vast, but the burdens of governing such immense territories grew heavier. The treasury strained under the weight of wars and the costs of maintaining armies. Inflation began to erode the economy, fueled by the influx of silver from the New World that destabilized markets across Europe and the Middle East. Soldiers grew restless when their pay failed to meet their needs, and rebellions broke out in Anatolia, shaking the heart of the empire. Murad himself, increasingly withdrawn, sought solace in the harem, surrounding himself with poets, astrologers, and women. Yet the machinery of empire continued, driven by viziers, generals, and above all, the women of the palace who guarded their sons' futures with unrelenting determination. The most formidable of these women was Safiye Sultan, the consort of Murad and the mother of Mehmed IV. Safiye was of Albanian origin, brought into the harem as a slave and rising to extraordinary power. Like Roxolana before her, she commanded respect and fear in equal measure. When Mehmed ascended the throne in 1595, Safiye assumed the role of Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, and became one of the most influential figures of her time. European envoys wrote of her as the true power behind the throne, noting how she corresponded directly with Queen Elizabeth I of England and other monarchs. Her gifts and letters crossed seas, weaving a network of diplomacy that extended far beyond the palace walls. In her, Roxolana's legacy of female diplomacy found a new champion. The reign of Mehmed IV was darkened by blood. Upon his accession, he ordered the execution of 19 of his brothers, one of the most brutal acts in Ottoman history. The cries of the strangled princes echoed through the palace, a grim reminder of the ruthless necessity that defined dynastic survival. Safiye, as Valide Sultan, secured her son's throne through this act, but the horror of it lingered. Chroniclers wrote of the sorrowful processions of small coffins carried through the palace, each one containing the life of a potential rival extinguished in the name of stability. Mehmed himself was deeply shaken, yet the empire required firmness, not weakness, and so he ruled on, guided by his mother's counsel. The empire at this time stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the shores of North Africa to the mountains of Persia. Its armies remained formidable, yet cracks began to appear. The Janissaries, once the disciplined elite, grew increasingly unruly, demanding higher wages and greater privileges. The corruption of officials eroded the efficiency of governance. In the provinces, governors acted with greater independence, weakening the central authority of the Sultan. The vastness that had once been the empire's strength now strained its foundations. And yet, through it all, the harem remained the constant, a center of intrigue where mothers and wives shaped the future of the dynasty. The Sultanate of Women continued into the 17th century. Kösem Sultan, the wife of Ahmed I and mother of Murad IV, became perhaps the most powerful of all Ottoman women. She served as regent for her young sons and later her grandsons, and later her grandson, wielding authority openly, issuing orders and commanding viziers. Her reign as Valide Sultan extended for decades, and she became a central figure in Ottoman history. Her rule was marked by both wisdom and ruthlessness, for she navigated a treacherous court filled with rivals and assassins. In her, the line that began with Roxolana reached its fullest expression, the transformation of the harem into a center of sovereign power. But power also bred danger. Kösem was eventually overthrown and murdered by her own daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, who assumed her place as Valide Sultan. The Sultan. The palace that had once been a cage of silken walls had become a battlefield in its own right, where women contended for supremacy, where alliances shifted and lives were extinguished with silent efficiency. Yet the empire endured, shaped as much by these women as by the sultans themselves. Roxolana had once been mocked by her enemies as a slave who overreached, a concubine who dared to wield power. But by the 17th century, her example had become the norm, and the idea that the sultan's mother or consort might rule in his stead was no longer scandalous, but expected. The broader world watched with fascination. European envoys wrote dispatches not only about the sultans, but about the women who guided them. Letters were exchanged, gifts were sent, and alliances were forged through the invisible hand of the harem. The Sultanate of Women had become an institution in its own right, shaping foreign policy as much as domestic governance. And always, in the background, the memory of Roxolana lingered. She had been the first to break the old order, the first to marry a sultan, the first to wield political power openly. Every woman who followed in her footsteps owed something to her example, whether they acknowledged it or not. By the mid-17th century, the Ottoman Empire had changed. It was no longer the realm of conquering sultans who led armies to the gates of Vienna. It had become a realm of palace politics, of viziers and mothers, of intrigue and diplomacy. The grandeur of Suleiman's campaigns was replaced by the quiet but no less decisive maneuvers of women behind latticed screens. The empire remained vast, its monuments enduring, its armies still formidable, but its character had shifted. It was no longer a warrior's empire alone. It was an empire of families, of survival, of delicate balances maintained through cunning and willpower. And through it all, the story of Roxolana remained a touchstone. From her rise in the 16th century to the dominance of Kösem and Turhan in the 17th, her spirit infused the age. She had shown that a woman, even a slave, could command the destiny of a sultan and, through him, the destiny of millions. Her laughter had once echoed through the halls of Topkapi, and though she was long gone, its resonance remained in every decision made within those walls. The Sultanate of Women was her legacy, a chapter in Ottoman history that bore her mark indelibly. And though the empire would continue for centuries, her story ensured that its history could never again be told without the voices of its women. In the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire entered a phase of both magnificence and fragility, a paradoxical era where the dynasty stood at the height of its grandeur, yet also revealed cracks that would one day deepen into decline. It was a century when the role of women in the palace reached its zenith, when the harem became not merely the private domain of a sultan, but the true heart of power, Ma'ar. And at the center of this transformation stood Kösem Sultan, the woman who would come to be remembered as perhaps the most powerful and enduring of all Ottoman queen mothers. Her reign as Valide Sultan, her years as regent, her triumphs and her ultimate downfall together formed a story that embodied both the glory and the dangers of the Sultanate of Women. Kösem was born Anastasia, a Greek girl from the island of Tinos, who, like Roxolana before her, was taken into the empire as a slave. Beauty and intelligence carried her swiftly through the ranks of the harem, and she became the favored consort of Sultan Ahmed I. Unlike many of her predecessors, she did not remain in the shadows. She became Ahmed's legal wife and bore him several sons, establishing her position securely within the dynasty. When Ahmed died in 1617, Kösem's journey truly began. For in the Ottoman tradition, the death of a sultan often plunged the dynasty into uncertainty, with princes vying for succession and rival mothers maneuvering to secure the throne for their sons. Kösem, however, proved herself as resourceful and determined as Roxolana had been a century earlier. Ahmed's brother Mustafa briefly took the throne, a man whose fragile mind made him unfit to rule. The empire soon replaced him with Kösem's young son, Murad IV, and thus she entered the palace as Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. Because Murad was still a child, Kösem acted as regent, exercising sovereign power in his name. It was an extraordinary role for a woman in the Ottoman system, yet by this time it had become almost customary. Roxolana had shown what was possible, Safiye had followed, and now Kösem assumed the mantle. For nearly 2 decades she guided the empire, her word carrying the weight of law. The empire she ruled faced immense challenges. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy, Janissary soldiers grew unruly, and provincial governors defied central authority. Yet Kösem navigated these perils with remarkable skill. She negotiated with viziers, balanced the factions of the army, and dispensed charity on a vast scale. Her wealth funded mosques, schools, fountains, and soup kitchens, earning her both prestige and popular support. To the poor of Istanbul, she was a benefactress, the mother of the empire as well as of the sultan. To foreign envoys, she was the true sovereign, the woman behind the veil who held the empire in her grasp. When Murad IV came of age, he took control with a ferocity that shocked the court. He outlawed alcohol, tobacco, and coffee, enforcing his edicts with brutal severity. He personally patrolled the streets of Istanbul, executing violators on the spot. His reign was one of fear, but also one of strength, for he restored order to a realm that had seemed on the verge of collapse. Yet beneath his iron rule, Kösem remained influential. Though she no longer held the title of regent, she continued to advise her son, shaping decisions in subtle but decisive ways. Murad died young in 1640, leaving the throne to his brother Ibrahim, a sultan whose reign would test the very limits of dynastic endurance. Ibrahim, later remembered as Ibrahim the Mad, lacked the discipline and intellect of his predecessors. He was prone to fits of extravagance, paranoia, and reckless indulgence. His reign threatened to undo the stability that Kösem had worked so hard to maintain. Yet even in this, she sought to preserve the dynasty, restraining her son where she could, shielding the empire from his worst impulses and preparing for the succession of her grandsons. The harem once more became the true center of power, with Kösem standing at its heart, the matriarch who balanced chaos with her steady hand. Ibrahim's downfall came in 1648, when the janissaries and statesmen of the court could no longer tolerate his rule. He was deposed and later executed, an act that revealed both the ruthlessness of Ottoman politics and the willingness of the army to intervene when the dynasty faltered. Into the breach stepped Kösem once more, for the throne now passed to her young grandson, Mehmed IV. Once again she became regent, ruling in the name of a child sultan. Her decades of experience, her network of allies, her immense wealth and prestige all made her the natural choice. To many it seemed she was unassailable, the eternal mother of the empire, the true sovereign beneath the shadow of the throne. But power breeds enemies, and within the palace walls, another woman rose to challenge her, Turhan Sultan, the mother of Mehmed IV. According to Ottoman tradition, it was the Sultan's mother, not grandmother, who held the title of Valide Sultan. Turhan was young, ambitious, and determined not to be eclipsed by her formidable mother-in-law. The struggle between Kösem and Turhan became a battle for supremacy within the palace, one that would end in blood. Kösem, fearing that Turhan's influence might endanger her own position, contemplated removing her grandson and placing another prince on the throne, one whose mother she could more easily dominate. Rumors of this plot reached Turhan, and the younger woman acted first. One night in 1651, assassins entered Kösem's chambers. She fought fiercely, clawing and biting, but was finally strangled with the bowstring, the instrument that had claimed so many princes. The woman who had ruled the empire for decades, who had outlasted sultans and crises, perished in silence within the very palace she had once commanded. Her body was buried in the mausoleum of Ahmed I, the husband whose favor had begun her extraordinary journey. To her enemies, she was a schemer whose ambition had destabilized the dynasty. To her admirers, she was a sovereign in all but name, a woman whose wisdom and charity had sustained the empire in its darkest hours. In truth, she was both, for power in the Ottoman court was never simple, never pure. It was a mixture of necessity and ruthlessness, of devotion and ambition. With Kösem's death, Turhan assumed the role of Valide Sultan, ruling as regent for her young son. Though she had triumphed over her rival, she too faced immense challenges. The empire was at war with Venice, a long and costly conflict over the island of Crete. The treasury strained under the burden, and the janissaries grew restless once more. Yet Turhan proved herself capable. She allied with the Grand Vizier Köprülü Mehmed Pasha, granting him extraordinary authority to reform the state and restore order. This alliance marked a new phase in Ottoman politics, one where the power of the Vizierate grew even stronger, laying the foundation for the Köprülü era that revitalized the empire in the late 17th century. Turhan herself became a patron of monumental architecture, commissioning the Yeni Mosque in Istanbul, a project that had been begun by Safavid Sultan decades earlier, but left incomplete. By finishing it, Turhan inscribed her own legacy on the city's skyline, ensuring that her name would endure alongside those of her predecessors. She died in 1683, the same year the Ottomans suffered their great defeat at Vienna, an event that symbolized the turning of the tide. The empire would endure for centuries yet, but its age of expansion was over. The story of Kösem and Turhan marked the climax of the Sultanate of Women. It was an era when the harem stood at the very center of power, when mothers and wives shaped the fate of emperors and empires. It began with Roxolana, the slave who rose to command Suleiman, and reached its height with Kösem, the regent who ruled in her own right. It ended with Turhan, who passed her authority to the viziers, signaling a shift in the balance of power. But the memory of these women remained indelible. To the chroniclers of the time, they were figures of awe and fear, women whose ambition could topple princes, whose wisdom could preserve realms. To the people of Istanbul, they were benefactresses, builders of mosques and fountains, providers of bread and water. To foreign envoys, they were mysteries behind the veil, yet also indispensable allies. To history, they were the embodiment of the paradox of Ottoman power, women hidden from sight yet shaping the destiny of millions. The Sultanate of Women did not destroy the empire, nor did it save it. It was a reflection of the empire itself, vast and complex, resilient and fragile. It showed that power could reside in unexpected places, that the voice behind the curtain could be as decisive as the command on the battlefield. And at its heart, it carried forward the legacy of Roxolana, whose laughter had once filled the palace and whose will had forever altered the course of Ottoman history.